Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am going to talk you through all the books that I read in November. Now, first of all, thank you all for being so patient as I unexpectedly took a couple of weeks off between getting my booster vaccine and seeing people on my birthday weekend and going back into the Metropolitan Opera for the first time in 2 years. Things got a little bit busy and much more stressful than I thought they were going to be. Ultimately, they all had good consequences, but I really could not face getting myself in front of the camera then. But I am back with some very exciting reading news, and I cannot wait to tell you all about it and to hopefully keep better in touch over the next couple of months. Secondly, I also apologize for the slightly strange lighting. It is a very cozy day here in New England. We got our first tiny bit of snow this morning, which is very exciting, so hence I am in my heaviest sweatshirt and I need to have the lights on as there is very little natural light coming in today. So the first book I read in November was something light and fun, or at least I thought it would be light, which was The Splendor Falls by Susanna Kearsley. Those of you who have been here for a while know that I have been on a big Susanna Kearsley kick ever since about July. And I had picked this up at a book sale in July, so I thought this would make a lovely addition. And this is the story of Emily Braden, whose cousin Harry invites her to this small town in France where he is doing some historical research about Queen Isabel, the wife of King John. So she agrees to come, but Harry is not there when she arrives, which isn't entirely unlike Harry. But when he doesn't turn up for a couple of days, nor does she even receive a phone call from him, she starts to worry. However, she begins to meet a lot of other people living in the same hotel and begins to discover that there are both historical mysteries and mysteries in the present day that could both relate to Harry's disappearance. I must say, this book was a lot darker than I expected it to be, which isn't entirely unusual for Susanna Kearsley, but of the three that I have read so far, this is definitely the darkest. It took on much more of a mystery thriller vibe than a romance vibe, although there is an element of romance in here. Though I wasn't entirely pleased with the element of romance, because it seemed to come completely out of left field and was not explored as well as she has done in other novels. And in fact, the Queen Isabel plotline didn't really come into play very much, which I was very disappointed by. But it was still a very captivating read, the end especially because it took on that thriller tone, became very, very gripping, and I am glad I read it, and it was still a very pleasant read. But so far, The Winter Sea is still top of my list. I then went on to read another cozy, lovely book, which was Medinsky Square by Eva Ibbotson. And this was a book that I did not even know existed until recently. I knew that Eva Ibbotson had written 5 new adult, as I'm calling them, novels, which I loved and I read in 2019. But I did not know about this one. So I was thrilled to pick it up, and I thought it would have the same cozy historical romance themes that the other 5 did. And it is a historical romance, but it also is much darker and much more adult than I was expecting. It's the story of Susanna Weber, who is a wonderful seamstress and runs her own clothing store in Medinsky Square, which is a small square in Vienna. And it is not only about her life, but the life of everyone within that square who form their own kind of community. But that life is threatened when Medinsky Square is threatened. The government is threatening to clear it out to make way for more modern construction. Not only that, but we discover that Susanna is a mistress and that she had a child out of wedlock when she was younger and gave her up for adoption. But this tortures her in the years since, and she is desperate to know what became of that daughter. And all of those relationships and the complicated emotions that come out of those relationships are handled really, really well and really beautifully, I thought. Though it wasn't necessarily something that I was expecting to find. Next, for my nonfiction book of the month in honor of Nonfiction November, I read No Time to Spare by Ursula K. Le Guin. This was a book recommended to me by Marissa of Blatantly Bookish when I went and visited her in August. And it is a collection of essays that Ursula K. Le Guin wrote on her blog in the early 2010s. Marissa read the first essay aloud to me, and I loved it. I didn't think I had read any Ursula K. Le Guin. It turns out I did in fact read her Cat Wings series when I was very young, and I had forgotten all about it. But I had gotten the idea that she was a very serious sci-fi fantasy writer, and thus the essay took me completely by surprise in terms of how honest and how funny it was. So when I discovered that this was available as an ebook through my library, I was thrilled. And the rest of her essays were just as wonderful. She takes on such topics as getting older, her cat, the rise in swearing in literature, television, and society at large, and indeed everything in between, any topic you can think of. And she does so beautifully and mostly in a very funny way. I thoroughly loved these essays. I would read bits aloud to anyone who was around me as I was reading them, and it's gotten me really intrigued to read more of her nonfiction, if indeed it exists, because I have heard it said that she did not enjoy writing nonfiction. So I don't know how much is out there, but if there is more out there, I would love to read some of it. This month I also discovered the joy of NetGalley, and I was granted a number of proofs on NetGalley, and I was very, very excited about them. I read 2 this month, in fact. The first was A Net for Small Fishes by Lucy Jago, which has been out in the UK for a few months now, I think, and has just been released here in the US. It is the story of 2 women in Jacobean London, one of whom is a new wife of a courtier in the court of James I, who is very unhappily married, and the other is the wife of a court doctor, who is ordered to go see this young wife because she is, they don't use the word hysterical, but if it had been set in a later century, they definitely would have. She is dispatched to see if she can help this young woman. And she discovers exactly how dreadful her marriage is and how trapped she feels. And so these 2 women see each other as a kind of escape from their unsatisfactory lives. And they begin to plot to see how they can improve their lot in life. I enjoyed reading this book, but I feel like the summaries that I was given and the taglines that I was given didn't really summarize what the book is actually about. I was expecting that some sort of romance would form between these 2 women. It was tagged as an LGBTQ book. The setup that I was told made it sound as though they would form some sort of relationship. But that was not the case. What I found instead were plot lines full of murder and witchcraft and religion, which is also fantastic, but it felt very strange given that I was expecting something else to happen somewhere along the lines. And I did really enjoy it, even though it was rather vague, especially at the end. And there would be large gaps in the plot line where we would not know what happened to these women over a month or 2 months or so. And it wouldn't even really be alluded to. We would just pick up wherever they were and then carry on the plot from there, which I can understand in terms of not wanting to drag out the plot any more than you have to. But at the same time, it felt very unsatisfying. I feel like Lucy Jago could have acknowledged that lost time somehow, in order to make it feel a bit more logical. So overall, an enjoyable read, but not quite what I was expecting. That seems to be a theme with all the books I read this month. The second proof I read from NetGalley was Pride and Prejudice, a retelling by Laura Wood. I was thrilled to receive this proof, as I love Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen in general, as you all well know. And I really enjoy Laura Wood's writing. In fact, I'll be reviewing another one of her books later on. So I was really excited to see what she would do with Pride and Prejudice. I also loved the premise of the book at large. The whole idea of retelling it was to keep the plot and the characters and the overall story of Pride and Prejudice, but to retell it without the rather antiquated style that might put younger readers off reading Austen, which as a high school teacher I can definitely appreciate, although I am rather sad that Jane Austen's original style is becoming less and less appreciated. But if this can be a gateway to get new Janeites, then I am all for it. And overall, Laura Wood did keep the plot intact, and she even kept a lot of really iconic lines, which I really loved, so that if these young readers then went on to discover more about Austen and heard some of these lines referenced, or if they went on to watch any of the film adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, they could recognize those iconic moments. So I was really pleased about that. I only had 2 quibbles with it, which, after I submitted my review, I discovered a lot of other reviewers also felt the same way, which were that, number 1, the characters felt less developed. They felt like they had less of an interior life than in the original, which is very disappointing considering how detailed and how perfect Austen's character development is. And secondly, that in order to simplify the novel, Laura Wood took the plot at breakneck speed, which perhaps explains why the characters weren't fully developed, because she was racing through events just to get you to the end. And I felt like if she had slowed down and taken her time a little bit more, it would have felt like a much fuller retelling. But overall, I think it would still be a really good way to introduce younger readers to Austen's originals. And that book, I believe, is going to be published in January of this coming year. Next, I read a chapter of one of 3 books on my birthday itself in the hopes that I could bring some of their themes into my life in this new year and this new decade of my life. Then, of course, I got very busy, so over this past break, I have been trying to finish all of those books that I started. The first of them was Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day by Winifred Watson. Some of you may have seen the film. I saw the film as well, with Frances McDormand and Amy Adams, and I was really intrigued to read the book. I love literature and films from the 1930s and the surrounding decades. Plus, I didn't remember a lot of detail about the plot of Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day, so I was thrilled to become reacquainted with it when I read the actual novel. Parts of it certainly have not aged well. There are a couple of anti-Semitic references, and indeed I was dissatisfied with one of the relationships entirely, because he, despite being painted as a manly man who will take no nonsense and will be very, very good for this person, I found rather worrying. And I could see it turning, dare I say, abusive rather quickly. But nonetheless, the wonderful thing about it was watching Miss Pettigrew come into her own. If you're unfamiliar, it is the story of Miss Pettigrew, who is a governess who is given a post, and she goes to that post, but discovers that there are in fact no children there. There's been some sort of mix-up at the agency, but her new employer doesn't seem to realize. And she lives this glamorous life. She is a nightclub singer. She has multiple boyfriends. And Miss Pettigrew is thrown in at the deep end and gets to actually live like she never has before. And her storyline I found much more satisfying than Miss LaFosse's. I also greatly enjoyed the fact that it's illustrated throughout, and the facial expressions on some of these characters are just wonderful. I then read Under a Dancing Star by Laura Wood. See, I told you I'd read another one of her books. This is another retelling of Laura Wood's, but it's a retelling of Much Ado About Nothing, set in the 1930s between England and Italy. I loved it. I was slightly apprehensive given how I had mixed feelings about her retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and that Much Ado About Nothing is my favorite Shakespeare play. But I really, really loved this book. I would say it's less of a retelling and more like a prequel to Much Ado, in that we follow Bea, who is around 18, I want to say, who comes from a rich aristocratic family, and her parents are desperate to marry her off to the closest rich nobleman they can find, just to keep the estate in the family name. However, she does not want that. She is fascinated by science, and she doesn't like the boy they have lined up for her, and she isn't afraid to make a scene at a dinner party just to get out of this match. So her parents get incredibly frustrated and send her off to her Uncle Leo's in Italy, where she lives there with her cousin Hero, Uncle Leo's new fiancé, and a bunch of resident artists that they house, one of whom is Ben, who every time she meets him, some disaster ends up occurring, and they seem to misunderstand one another over and over again. And the setup is incredible. The way they handle the romance is beautiful. You were cheering for them the whole time. Plus, I loved the way they acknowledged the way that things were brewing throughout Europe. This taking place in the 1930s. Fascist ideas are taking root throughout the entirety of Europe. And typically, you only hear about those if you read a book set in Germany or the surrounding area. People rarely touch on how those ideas manifested themselves in other countries like Italy, how the English were also rather seduced by those ideas and how people could see them as a good idea, and also why other people might not. And I loved the way they handled that. I found it really, really fascinating. It was utterly engaging. I loved every single minute of this book. And lastly, I read a chapter of A Mistress of My Fate by Hallie Rubenhold, which is the first in what could be an eventual trilogy. I'm not sure. 2 books are definitely published. I'm not sure if a third is coming. I am currently in the middle of reading this, which is why I just have the slipcover. The actual book is downstairs. And I am currently a quarter of the way through it, because it is rather long, but I am really enjoying it. It is historical fiction by the author of some rather spectacular nonfiction, so I have high hopes for how this is going to turn out. It is the story of Henrietta Lightfoot, who is the orphaned niece of a rich, well-to-do family in the 18th century. And it's the story of her fall from grace, her ultimate disgrace, and then how she must try to climb to the top of the social ladder again by any means possible, including gambling, flirting, and her wits and intelligence. Only being a quarter of the way through, I am loving it so far. You can definitely feel a lot of influence from major 18th century novels like Moll Flanders and Fanny Hill and Tom Jones and Clarissa, all kinds of major nods to the literature of the era. But it also feels completely fresh and completely new. And I'm really loving it so far. I hope it continues. And I hope I eventually get my hands on book 2 to finish the series so far. And lastly, to tie in with the Splendor Falls and to try to finish all of Shakespeare's acknowledged published works this year, I read King John yesterday. So I will have a review of that up in a week or two. But this is another of Shakespeare's histories, so of course it follows King John, brother of Richard I. You may have heard of him from Robin Hood and other tales. So this is the story of the end of his life, which I really know very little about, quite honestly. And thus, I didn't really follow the story in terms of its historical accuracy. Apart from that, there isn't a lot of plot to describe. He is continually fighting wars with a prince of France, and no one is entirely sure why people's claims to French territories and English territories are in dispute to start with. Has also insulted the Pope, but then wins papal favor again, and then is inexplicably poisoned by the end of it. It's very confusing, and it wasn't one of my favorites, but I am glad to have read it. And I would be intrigued to watch or listen to a production, which is why it may take me a week or two to get my review up, because that may A, clear up a few things, and B, I would be intrigued to see how the female characters are portrayed, because those were the scenes that I found most interesting. When his mother, Queen Eleanor, otherwise known as Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his sister-in-law, Constance, I think her name was Constance, who was the wife of his brother Geoffrey, get into face-offs. They are both very strong women and who are desperate to fight for their sons' rights, respectively. And those create some really interesting connotations, and I think if you were one of those actresses, you could do a lot with it. So there you have it. I did not get through all of the books that I hoped to this month, but I did get through a very exciting collection. Please let me know down below if you have read any of these books and if you have similar or indeed different thoughts than I did, or if you have any other recommendations for me based on what I've read. I will be back soon to tell you about my plans for December. I hope to see you all again in the future very soon. Until then, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.